Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Brenna Davis, and I am the Director of Integral Ecology at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And we're so glad that you're here. We see that we've got a whole class of students here. And so we're going to be going over the environmental policy briefing for the Ignatian Family Teach-in. Before we get started, I do just want to do two brief introductions. First, I would like to introduce Tom Mulloy. He is the Director of Government Relations at the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States Office of Justice and Ecology. And Tom and the Office of Justice and Ecology are good friends of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And so he's going to be talking a little bit later about the Environmental Justice for All Act. And also just Tom has worked on the Hill and just knows kind of little tips and tricks that might be helpful for your advocacy meetings. And then we also have Marianne Comfort here, and she is the Justice Coordinator for Earth, Anti-Racism, and Women for the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. And Marianne is just very integrally involved in a lot of Catholic environmental advocacy. And so Marianne and Tom were close conspirators on putting together the talking points for this year's teach-in. So thank you all for being here. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Okay, great. I am going to share my screen. Alrighty. So just before we get started, I did want to kind of share briefly a couple of basic messages that we are trying to get across in our meetings with our legislators. The first is that as people of faith, we believe that equality and equity and justice, a framework for environmental policy, is the driving determinant of a good and bad policy, right? So equity and justice are at the central of any environmental policy that we would like to see, and that we are looking for environmental policy that builds just, equitable, and resilient communities. For any of the delegate leaders that are on the call, just two quick notes that I wanted to point out. One is that we heard your call that our backgrounders and talking points were a little complex this year, so we have greatly simplified them. So it's just 2 pages, front and a back. And so we want to reiterate the message that we tried to keep it simple, but we know that in your advocacy groups, you can go deeper. And so if you have any questions or anything that you would like to raise here, we are very open to hearing from you. Okay. And so before we actually get started, I would like to begin with a prayer. I forgot my prayer slide, but we are doing this work, this advocacy work, as a central part of our faith and as people of faith. And so I just invite us to begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And dear loving God, we also know as advocate, as someone who walks alongside us and speaks for justice, we pray that your Spirit come down and give us the courage to share our voices for justice as we meet with our legislators and ask for policy changes to bring about your reign here on earth, a world that is sustainable, habitable, and just for all people. Amen. Okay, so the agenda for today is I'm going to very generally go over the backgrounder and talking points, and then Tom and Marianne are here, and they're going to go a little bit deeper into 2 of the policy asks that we have, and then the rest of the time will be available for Q&A. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat, or we can unmute at the end. So as you saw in your backgrounder, the current context that we are living in is that we are citizens of a country that has a central role to safeguarding our planet. And so particularly with our historical emissions, we have a debt to pay to other countries that have not admitted as much, but are feeling the impacts of climate change most directly. So we can see the intensification of climate change in recent events. So the picture to the right is a picture of flooding in Pakistan that happened almost immediately after a drought and a heat wave, right? So we heard a lot about the flooding, but maybe not about the heat wave that was happening that was historic right before that. And we know that there are many events that have happened in the recent months that show that we need to take decisive action on climate legislation in our country. And so we know that global temperatures are expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in the next 20 years. So this really is the window and the moment where we need to cut our emissions to avoid kind of worst case scenarios, even though we can already see the impacts that are happening now. Something that I think is really important to mention, and I won't go into great detail here, but again, this is something that you can ask more questions about, is some of you may have heard about the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So this was kind of a surprise to some of us who were really concerned about climate. We did not know that climate legislation would, if it would get pushed through after the legislative season last year. But this Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 did pass, and it is set to cut emissions by 40% by 2030. And it is the largest kind of historic climate legislation that the United States has passed. And so as you're thinking about doing your environmental advocacy and when you're meeting with your legislators, it would be a really good idea to research to see if they supported this legislation, and if they did, to thank them, and if they didn't, maybe there are a few questions around that or things that come up in your conversation related to that. But we felt like it was really important to acknowledge that steps have been taken in the right direction. But what we also know is that we need more, that this is a great step in the right direction, but it is not enough. So to very clearly summarize our asks, we are asking that our legislators support legislation that accelerates the just transition to clean energy to mitigate climate change, that invests in sustainable infrastructure, that prioritizes communities most impacted by environmental injustice, and that supports mining law reform. And as we talk through each of these asks, I think that you will see kind of how all of these issues are interconnected as we were thinking about our policy asks. Oh, I hit the wrong button. Sorry. I'm gonna reshare my screen. Okay. And so to begin, we need to accelerate the just transition to clean energy. And what is really important about this is a just transition. And this will come up in some of our later asks, but we recognize that in the transition to renewables, we really need to think about particularly transitional support for communities that are dependent upon fossil fuel jobs and communities that are overburdened by fossil fuel pollution. And we also have to think about, as we're transitioning to renewables, that we don't repeat extractive patterns that we have done, particularly in BIPOC communities and low-income communities. The second ask that we have is we are asking for investment in sustainable infrastructure. And so some of that is inherent in the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of that will be happening. But I think the most recent example of where we can see a lack of sustainable infrastructure and infrastructure disinvestment in certain communities is in Jackson, Mississippi. So if you've seen the news, you saw that the capital of Mississippi, which has a population population that is about 80% Black was without water for over 7 weeks this summer, right? And some of that was due to the failing infrastructure of their water systems, and that the country and the state had not invested in this community, right? We also see the need to invest in infrastructure such as mass transit, right? We know that we are going to be shifting hopefully more to electric vehicles, but we also know that we have to extract resources to do that. And so we need to also be thinking about ways to invest in our communities that are just generally less resource intensive. The third ask that we have is that we prioritize communities most impacted by environmental justice issues. So last year we had Sharon Levine was at the teach-in from Rise St. James in Cancer Alley, Louisiana, and she had been working to, with her community, fight a plastics manufacturing facility that was going to be built in her neighborhood, which already has a disproportionate amount of the burden of pollution. And so good news is we just got word that some of the permits have been pulled by a judge. So it seems likely that that plant won't be built in their community, right? And so as we think about environmental policies and this transition of energy, we really need to prioritize environmental justice communities. And specifically, environmental justice communities are defined as usually, again, BIPOC and low-income communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and pollution. And so one of the pieces of legislation that we are lifting up is the Environmental Justice for All Act. And so at this point, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And I would love for Tom just to take a few moments to talk a little bit about the Environmental Justice for All Act and share some insights that he has.
Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you. Brenna, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for that very useful summary. Man, I want to try to organize my thoughts in a logical way and do a little bit of both, do a little bit of like general advocacy as it relates to the bill and the bill itself. Brenna mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed earlier. Many of you may have heard of it. I think that's a great place to start when talking about this bill. First, because it took a ton of energy and dedication of a lot of people to get that bill signed into law. I don't think it checks everybody's boxes for what they wanted to see either in an environmental bill, in a climate bill, or in a reconciliation bill, which is like the geeky term that they used to move the bill. But it's a huge accomplishment, and we should, as Brenna said, thank the folks that participated in that. The Environmental Justice for All Act is what can be considered the natural progression from, or what should be considered the natural progression from, the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to pump a ton of money into communities, into renewable energies. But it was just that. For the most part, it was just a lot of money because of the way they had to pass it. The Environmental Justice for All Act is now policy and standards. And more specifically, it's policy and standards that empowers marginalized voices and brings them into the center of the conversation. So when you start talking about the Environmental Justice for All Act, you know, it's a big bill. It's 137 pages. It has a lot in there. So it's important to stay high level and talk about the principles and why this is important. If there's legislators or staff that want to get into the nitty-gritty, then you'll have that information. But to the extent possible, talk about where we're coming, why this is important to get to where we want to go, why it's important to your community. It does like I said, it does a lot of things. It not only does it empower those marginalized communities and marginalized voices in the decision-making process, but it also spends more, it also has more money going out to communities to do things like develop research and training and education programs around environmental justice. And it has research into health equity. So, like a lot of those issues out there where the climate impact is only the first issue, because then there's those knock-on health effects for people, where you have, like, Cancer Alley is a great example, right? You have like these cancer effects in the community. So it's got a whole bunch of stuff that does a lot more, other than just, in addition to, I should say, not in addition to centering those voices. So a couple notes on that. You guys are not, like, most of us are not going to be policy experts on this big 140-page bill. And so don't try to be. Acknowledge that you're not policy experts, but what you are community experts. You are place experts, and more importantly, and most importantly, your constituents. And that's why your voice matters. And so focus on that. Tell those stories about why you think this bill is important to your community, to your state. If somebody asks, if there's a staffer that asks a question, or if you ever encounter a question that you just don't know the answer to as part of the bill, don't let that hang you up. If somebody asks you a question, you say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question, but I promise to get you that answer, and then you move on. Because we don't want to let those really difficult, weedy questions take up valuable time that you have to tell your story and to try to get a feel for where that member of Congress is on supporting the legislation. And then you turn around and you email Brenna, you email myself, and you say, hey, can you follow up with this office, because they really wanted to know an answer to this question. So that was the other thing I wanted to mention about advocacy as it relates to what could be kind of technical policy in a couple of places. Brenna and I had a conversation earlier today with committee staff that they handle this bill for a living, and he made a very important point about, so what was it, section 7 of the bill. And one of the concerns that offices will raise is the pollution impact research, but it's important to keep in mind that there's a case study in New Jersey that covers this. We don't want to get into those conversations. We want to stay up here. This is why it's important to us. This is why it's important to our community, and then we'll follow up. So if that sort of stuff comes up, don't be afraid to push it to the side and pivot. Let me see. Let me see if I can share my screen real quick.
Yeah, you should be able to share.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to give you a little bit of homework, everyone.
I mean, depending on, this is just, I was poking around the website because the Natural Resources Committee has a bunch of great information about this. But here is, if you want to do a little bit of homework as you prep, you go to congress.gov. I could just go like this. And you'll come to you'll get to this page if you type in HR 2021 right here in the search bar. You get to the bill, and here is where you can find out if your member of Congress is a co-sponsor. You just click on co-sponsor, and here's the list. It even sorts by state. So if you're over in Pennsylvania, then you know that only 2 members of Congress out of I believe it's an 18-person delegation have co-sponsored that, because then you can walk in and say thank you, because it's really important that members of Congress, they get complained at a lot, and staff get complained at a lot, and this is what we need, and this is what we want, and this is what you're not doing, but they do like to hear thanks. And so if you get an opportunity, check in on your member of Congress and see if they have sponsored it. You can also check in on your senator, because you'll come to the related bill and go to the Senate bill, and you can find out which senators have co-sponsored the bill as well. So again, thanks. We really appreciate your support, and then move on. I think that's the only sort of homework that we wanted to give, but happy to answer more questions as we move on. I could keep going, but I won't.
Well, and I think that it was really interesting to hear from the member of the Natural Resources Council who basically said, especially in the House, they are looking for more co-sponsors of the bill. They're not going to bring it to vote until they know that they have enough support. So one of your tasks or one of your asks could be, if you go and see that your representative has not co-sponsored the bill, but seems like they're a representative that would be supportive of this, one of your asks during your meeting might be, hey, we're wondering, are you willing to co-sponsor this bill? And if not, why not? So that's kind of an entry point that that the staffer that we talked to suggested. And Tom, do you mind dropping the link for the House version of the bill? I think I got the Senate version.
Oh yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
I actually might have put the wrong link. Sorry if I did. Okay, so we're gonna keep moving on, and we just have one more talking point that we want to share about, and that is Indigenous rights, extraction, and a just transition towards clean energy. Something that we know is true is that if we are going to transition towards clean energy, right, like electric cars, that there is a need for lithium to be used to create batteries, right? So our cell phones, our laptops, any battery that we're using at this point, that powers technology is powered by lithium. And so what we are seeing is that there are many Indigenous communities specifically that are located near where lithium is in the United States. And so now we're seeing Indigenous communities being threatened by mining in and around their communities, which, if you are familiar with Brophy Prep in Arizona, their Native American club has been partnering with the Apache Stronghold to save an area called Oak Flat, which is sacred land that a copper mining company is attempting to drill on, and that would completely destroy the land. Thacker Pass in Nevada is basically one of the largest areas of lithium ion that we have in the country. And so there are many individuals within 25 miles, many Indigenous communities that have grave concerns about the impact of this on their communities, on the air, on the water. And so just as we think about our general narrative, right, we've gotten into this situation because we have been extracting resources from the earth without much intention or care for consulting local communities. And so as we move towards a just transition, we don't want to repeat that process. And so there is a piece of legislation that is called the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act. And so I just want to invite Marianne Comfort, who is on the Interreligious Working Group on Extractive Industries. She just knows a lot about extraction, just to share some thoughts about this and what you might share.
Sure, great. So I think as been pointed out by both Brenna and Tom, when we talk about the climate change and addressing climate change, how we make the transition is just as important as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So when we're talking about the transition, we're talking about a lot of minerals. Brenna named lithium and copper, but there's also cobalt, there's nickel, there's lots of minerals. And we know that in the US, the vast majority of the deposits of these minerals are on or very near indigenous land. So we have on the books a law that governs mining on public lands that's 150 years old. It was passed in 1872. So just imagine that back in 1872, you had guys with pickaxes who were chopping at the rock to get gold out of the ground. And we're having the same laws that govern that are still in operation when we're blasting mountains to get at coal underneath, and when we're having huge open pit mines to get lithium, copper, cobalt, and the rest of it. So clearly that law is no longer adequate. So this bill, the Clean Energy Minerals Reform Act, basically is saying we need to update the law. If there's going to be any mining on public land that you and I, all of us own as taxpayers, then we need to make sure it's done in a good way. So this law would make sure that companies actually have to pay something to mine on public lands. Right now they don't. They can just go in and mine and not have to pay the government anything. So we want to make sure they pay royalties. We want to make sure that after they're done mining, they clean it up, and they clean it up adequately. We want to make sure that there's consultation, that they actually talk with those indigenous communities nearby and make sure that those indigenous communities are able to give input about how they want this to be done. And then finally, this actually allows federal agencies to say, no, there are some parts of this land, this public land, that is too sacred to indigenous communities or is too environmentally important that we are going to take it off limits for mining altogether. So these are really important pieces that if we're going to be doing mining for the minerals needed for this transition, we want to make it done. It's done in a fair and just way.
Thanks so much, Marianne. All right, so I'm just going to share my screen one last time. I have one kind of more slide, and then we'll jump into Q&A. And so basically, just some final thoughts that I wanted to share, particularly in light of our meeting with the committee member that we were able to talk to from the Natural Resources Council. One, it's really important to do your due diligence before you go into your meetings with your legislators, right? So if a legislator is already supportive or a co-sponsor of particular legislation, thank them, but you don't need to convince them, right? If they're already like on board for the Environmental Justice for All Act, then you don't need to go through your 20 talking points about why this is important. You can have kind of a deeper or more nuanced conversation about, as a constituent, like how can we help support this? You can kind of take the conversation in a different direction. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was it's okay to go off script, right? So I know that sometimes when we prepare for the teach-in, it's like everybody's got their script and you've got your part and you've got your part and everyone's trying to kind of follow the flow. But I think that what we're actually being invited to do in these conversations is what Pope Francis calls us to do, to build a culture of encounter, right? And to have conversations with the staffer. So, ask questions, try to think of, give them some time to respond. If you do have deep burning questions that you're wondering about, why your legislator is doing or not doing a particular action that you think is important. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is to, if you are able, react to the person in the room, right? If they are sharing you may be talking to a staffer, you may be talking to the representative or the senator themselves, but really just notice their posture, notice maybe unstated values that they're sharing that you can kind of pick up on to develop the conversation. And so you might want to get all of your talking points out of the way up front, go in really clearly saying, this is our ask. We want you to support the Environmental Justice for All Act and mineral reform or whatever you're going to focus on in your meeting. And then ask some questions about, like, can you describe how this decision is going to be made, or, just kind of follow up. You could also invite them into your community, right? Especially if you're talking to your representative. They are tied to kind of usually a closer geographic distance to you. And so you might want to invite them in to see kind of what you're doing and how what you're talking about relates to where you are. I think that is also the most important thing, especially with environmental policy. Things can feel very theoretical. And so we're being invited to connect policy to place. And so what I would really hope that all of you would do in preparation for your meetings is look at the talking points and ask yourselves the question, how is this playing out in our own community, right? So you might not be directly impacted, but what are environmental justice issues in your own community that you know about, that you're concerned about, that you think this legislation would address? What we've heard time and time again is that kind of stating the facts isn't always what sways us as human beings. So if you are able to share a personal narrative, that can be really powerful. And I asked this person that's on the Natural Resources Committee, I said, do personal stories like really work, or is it just like people are kind of like have their heels dug in on kind of issues? And he said that, it can be really impactful for a staffer to kind of hear a story that is very authentic and that, touches their heart in a certain way, that they may go back and talk to their boss about this issue in a new way that can kind of create a little bit of space and maybe a little bit of movement. So please really, as you're preparing, think about how can we connect personal stories from where we are with this kind of theoretical legislation.
Brenna, could I just add something
please.
to that?
Yeah.
I just want to add that another piece that's really important about sharing stories and your own experiences and your own concerns is they can't argue with that. You don't want to get stuck in sharing facts and figures that they're going to argue with, and they're going to come back with their facts and figures. If you're sharing your personal story, it's your personal story, and they're going to need to listen to it, and they can't argue with your personal story. So I think keeping it to your experience, your concerns, and not wading into facts and figures that you're going to end up with a debate around is super important, and it makes it more enjoyable for you and more productive in the long run.
Yeah. And I think, like, again, if we're talking about like building an ongoing relationship with our legislators, you don't build a relationship with friends by sharing facts and figures, right? You share stories, you share kind of what's important to you, what you value deeply. And so obviously you're not trying to become best buds with the staffer in your representative or senator's office, but storytelling, I think, is sometimes not something that we emphasize enough. And I think, especially with environmental work, again, it needs to be place-based, right? We have to see how, I live in Cleveland, Ohio, near the Great Lakes. So like drought is not an issue that we are experiencing in our region, but what are the regional issues that are affecting your area? How can you bring your community with you into the room? The other thing that the staffer shared with us, I just put a link in the chat. This is a website from the Natural Resources Committee. And so they were just saying there are a lot of case studies on there. So please don't get overwhelmed. But if you're really like, I don't know how, environmental justice plays itself out in my community, one, maybe do research in your community, do some outreach. But if you're really stuck, there are case studies on this website that I think can be really helpful. Or you can mention the things that are in the backgrounder, like Jackson, Mississippi, like Oak Flat, like Thacker Pass. But the more personalized you can make it, the better. And the final thing that I'll say, and I don't need to share my slides for this, is just, since we are trying to build relationships with people, I think it is really helpful and important to fill out our report back form. And I know that's not the most exciting part of doing legislative visits. And I know that a lot of you, if you're traveling to the Teach-in, you're going to go to your visit and then you're going to be rushing back to school, and then you might be in the classes the next morning. But we would just really like to emphasize that if you can just take a few minutes to fill that out for your delegate delegation, we'll have a bigger sense of the impact we're collectively having as an Ignatian family and as a network. And then we will also be able to help you follow up with your legislators. You know, say you talk to someone and you say, oh, you seem supportive of the Environmental Justice for All Act. And they say, yes, we are. Well, will you co-sponsor it? Then you want to follow up with them in a few weeks to see that they actually did what they said they were going to do. So yeah, and I think, again, feel free to invite them into your community. I think that that is a big goal of this, is to build those relationships that are enduring. Oh, and thank you. Aaron just shared the report back form in the chat. And I know that that exists probably in many places on websites and in emails. So now, thank you for listening to us talk at you a lot, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute and to ask them. Yeah, that's what we're here for. Anything not make sense? Anything? Okay, well, Tom, yeah, or Marianne and Tom, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I would like to, I wanted to add that these, you know, at any given point, I want to really harp on this. At any given point, it was a while ago, I think it has to do with the previous Congress, but so I don't know if this is updated, probably a good rule of thumb, but at any given point, close to 40% of Congress, that's the Senate and the House, has served less than 2 terms. There's an extraordinary amount of churn going on up on the Hill at any given point, to say nothing of the staff that are also moving on a fairly regular basis. That is all to say that there's a lot of really smart folks up there who know their policy, but again, they may not be constituents themselves. Those staff, they might not know about the neighborhood or the community or the state past, you know, the policy that they work on. So that's why it's incumbent upon us to bring those concerns and the stories up to the Hill. They don't, you know, the members of Congress represent close to 750,000 people in your average congressional district, and some of them are quite large. Senators represent whole states. It's impossible for them to know at any given moment the perspectives and the feelings and the concerns of all of their constituents. So that's why it's really important that we focus on what our lived experiences, what the lived experiences of our neighbors. And the second point that I want to make is, this is also an opportunity to build relationship with these offices, because all of them have constituent service offices back in your community, back in your city, back in your town, back in the state. And so it's also an opportunity to invite them into deeper relationship by having a site visit, by having a meeting with them at their local office, and continuing to build that relationship. So don't think of this as the one thing that you do when you go to DC every year, but a step along the process of, as Brenna put it earlier, building deeper relationships, entering into a culture of encounter with these offices.
And not to, you know, repeat, you know, I always say Ignatian repetition, but like, I think that what's really, sometimes I have felt in the past when I've done advocacy visits, like, will this really matter? But I think, again, when we think about the historic moment we are living in, especially as we think about climate and we think about the US's influence in the world, if the United States became a global leader in reducing carbon emissions, others would follow along. And that's what we need to do as a global community. Like, this is the moment that we need to take drastic action in the next 10 years. I mean, in the last 10 years, but like, we're living in a really historic window for the future of humanity. And so I think that that's kind of a tall order, but that also, you know, just makes your voice and what you have to share really important. And so so we're just so grateful that you're taking the time to prepare to have these meetings, because they really, really do matter, you know, in the short term and for future generations. Not to make too big of a deal out of it, but you know, this is really important. So
Brenna, if I can just add to that, I think young people in particular have some powerful sway with members of Congress. One of my favorite stories is one of our partner organizations had a group of middle school students that was going into an office that had not, you know, engaged at all on the climate issues. And they were told they had like 15 minutes or something to meet with this particular member of Congress. They ended up with meeting with him for an hour. He was so taken. These young people, middle schoolers, okay, middle schoolers were so prepared, and they were just speaking from their heart about why climate change mattered to them, what they were scared of about climate change. And he ended up writing back to them and telling them that they moved him so much that he was now going to prioritize addressing climate change. So again, speaking from the heart, sharing your fears, sharing your hopes, sharing your experiences, that's what moves minds and hearts.
thanks, Marianne. That's a beautiful story. Thanks for sharing that. All right. So especially, I think we have Gonzaga here. Is that the high school we have here? Mr. Barry? Yeah. Yeah. Do y'all have any questions? Like, you're the only class we've got here, but we're really excited. You're good? You ready?
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry. We actually, sorry, we're trying to figure out the logistics here. It's pretty echoey, but here's our teach-in delegates. Yay.
Wonderful. And what school are you from?
So we're in Palm Desert. And when you were talking about lithium, recently in the news for us, lithium is pretty significant amount under the salt in the Salton Sea area. Excuse me if the echo is. So, oh, okay. So anyways, I was just shouting out to the kids when you brought it up, that that's part of our, hopefully what we'll kind of add to our preparation. So,
That's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah. So thanks for having us. Thanks for all the information. We just have to get a little organized, but we're good. They're all excited. They're here eating pizza. So thank you.
That's awesome. And again, speak from the heart, like Marianne said. That's what really matters. Share your experience.
We're also in so we're in Palm Desert area, so we're also pretty close to we have a lot of agricultural you know, fields and migrant workers who are working our fields as well. So it's just interesting with the solar, the lithium, the migration. We've got a lot to share. So we're excited, but we just got to get organized.
Yes, that makes complete sense. And again, you know, another question you might ask is just how long you have with the staffer or the representative. And maybe you prepare, if you do get a whole half an hour, we're going to talk about both issues, or you might have to cut things down, and that's okay. You know, do what you can. Great. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. If you have any questions, I'm going to share my email in the chat. I'm also sharing a great project that I worked on with Marianne and the Catholic Climate Covenant, all about the interconnections of environmental justice with climate and with different communities. So migrant workers, air pollution, urban heat islands, redlining, it's all interconnected. So if that's helpful, please use that. And I'm going to put my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. We're here to support you as you're preparing, and we can't wait to see you in DC at the end of the month.
Thanks, Brenna. I'll just add too, as a reminder, we'll be on Zoom, the same link tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern for our migration policy overview. So feel free to join us then. And if you can't, know that we'll send out all 3 recordings: yesterday's Advocacy 101, today's ecology overview, tomorrow's migration overview. We'll send all of the recordings. My goal is to send them on Friday to you all via email.
Great. Thanks, Erin. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Good being with you.
Thank you, Marianne and Tom.